They scoffed at the delivery driver, ridiculing him at every turn, until the day he became their executive and presented them with their termination notices. Dorian Matthews had dedicated almost a decade to deliveries across downtown Phoenix. He knew every back alley, every service entry, every receptionist who barely acknowledged him during a drop-off. The work wasn't glamorous, but it provided for him, and he took immense pride in his efficiency. Most people saw him as just another uniform, a background figure, someone inconsequential. At Whitmore & Klein, a lavish high-end marketing agency with marble floors and expansive windows, this dismissive attitude was particularly palpable. The first time Dorian entered those glass doors, he expected a routine drop-off. However, he quickly observed the way employees regarded him, as if he were invisible or worse, something to be dismissed entirely. The receptionist hardly looked up as she signed for the package, already preoccupied with something she deemed more important. That was fine, he was accustomed to it. But with time he began to notice more. The hushed whispers, the subtle smirks, the way some employees chuckled as he passed by. Initially, he dismissed it as his imagination until it became undeniable. One afternoon, as he placed a package on the counter, a voice pierced the office chatter. "Man, can you imagine if the delivery guy was our boss?" Laughter erupted. Dorian didn't turn, but a flush of heat rose in his chest. He recognized the voice. Ryan Caldwell, a senior account executive, always impeccably dressed in tailored suits, always making jokes loud enough for everyone to hear. Another voice chimed in, this time a woman's. "Please, he's probably used to lifting boxes, not leading meetings." More laughter. Dorian maintained a neutral expression, handing the receptionist the tablet for her signature. She returned it without a word. He had faced worse. Years of experience had taught him to disregard such slights. Yet something about this particular moment lingered. It wasn't just the words. It was the sheer confidence behind them, the absolute certainty that someone like him could never be in a position of authority. He headed toward the exit, passing rows of glass-walled offices where employees sat at sleek desks, sipping overpriced coffee and feigning productivity. Some cast uninterested glances. Others barely registered his presence. Just another delivery guy, just another man passing through. But as he reached the door, he caught his reflection in the glass. His uniform, his delivery scanner clipped to his belt, his hands calloused from years of lifting. They saw him as nothing more than that uniform, and for the first time in a long time, it truly bothered him. Outside, the Arizona sun was blinding. He climbed into his van and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. He wasn't angry, anger was fleeting. This was something deeper, sharper. They thought they knew who he was. They had no idea. But soon they would. Dorian wasn't one to dwell on trivialities. He'd endured his fair share of disrespect over the years. People speaking condescendingly, assuming he was uneducated, acting as if he were invisible. It wasn't new, nor was it surprising. But the incident at Whitmore & Klein had struck a chord. That night, after completing his last delivery, he parked his van outside his modest apartment in Mesa. It wasn't much. A single bedroom, worn carpet, a kitchen past its prime, but it was his. He sat in the dark for a while, still gripping the steering wheel, staring at the glow of a street light outside his window. For years he had told himself that what others thought didn't matter, as long as he worked diligently and earned an honest living. But tonight that logic fell flat. The laughter at Whitmore & Klein wasn't born of mere ignorance. It was a deep-seated conviction. Those individuals genuinely believed they were superior to him, that someone like him could never hold a position of power. He needed to confide in someone. Dorian retrieved his phone and called the only person who had ever truly understood him. His older brother, Malcolm. Malcolm answered after 2 rings. "Yo, you good?" "I'm good," Dorian replied. "What's up with you?" Dorian hesitated. "Had one of those days." Malcolm chuckled. "Let me guess, some well-off folks made you feel like you didn't belong in their space?" Dorian exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "Something like that, yeah." "Well, ain't nothing new." "It's not," Dorian conceded, "but today was different." Malcolm didn't press him, he never did. He simply waited. "They laughed," Dorian finally said, "like outright laughed at the idea of me being anything more than a delivery guy." Malcolm went silent for a moment. "And that got to you?" "It did." Another pause. Then Malcolm said something Dorian hadn't expected. "Good." Dorian frowned. Good. Yeah, Malcolm continued, means you're finally tired of it. Dorian leaned back, staring at the dashboard. What am I supposed to do, quit my job because a couple of idiots don't respect me? Nah, but you're smarter than that. Smarter than them too. Dorian let those words sink in. He had always possessed a knack for numbers and strategy. At 16 he turned a few $100s into several thousand by flipping sneakers. Later he ventured into investing, stocks, small businesses, even real estate. He understood the game better than most, but he had never fully committed. Malcolm's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Remember what Dad used to say? When people only see you one way, you've got two choices. Prove them right or prove them wrong. Dorian exhaled. Yeah, I remember. Then what are you gonna do? Dorian didn't answer immediately. He thought about Whitmore and Klein, the expensive suits, the arrogant smirks, the way they had scoffed at the notion of him being anything more than a package delivery man. They perceived him as insignificant, and perhaps until now he had been thinking small. He looked at the worn steering wheel beneath his hands, then at the dashboard where a stack of delivery invoices sat. This wasn't all he was, he knew that. But they didn't, and that needed to change. Because proving them wrong wasn't going to be an overnight feat, but it was going to happen. Dorian wasn't simply a delivery guy, not truly. That was the facade he presented, the part they assumed was his entirety. But beneath the uniform, the routine drop-offs and the worn work boots, lay another facet of him, one known to very few. While they spent their days crafting marketing campaigns and analyzing client figures, Dorian had been crunching numbers of his own. He had always possessed a keen business sense, even as a child. While other kids spent their allowances on toys, he was flipping sneakers. Limited editions, hard-to-find releases. He knew precisely when and where to acquire them, and more importantly who would pay double, sometimes triple for a pair. By the time he was 20 he had transitioned to cars, buying and selling used vehicles, mastering negotiation and identifying deals before anyone else. He invested in stocks, funneling money into small businesses. He never boasted, never discussed it, but he observed, he learned, he built. And over the past year, something even more substantial had been developing. Dorian had been cultivating a business proposal that had garnered the attention of serious investors. Individuals uninterested in his background or profession, but rather in his expertise. They recognized his potential. They saw how he dissected businesses, pinpointing weaknesses and discerning their inherent value before anyone else. Now they were prepared to back him. He had been meeting with them in the evenings after long shifts, spending late nights on Zoom calls, meticulously reviewing financial statements and refining his strategy. He had already quietly and efficiently revitalized two struggling businesses. No one at Whitmore and Klein would ever suspect it, but they were about to find out. One evening he sat opposite his lead investor Anthony Wells, in a private lounge at a downtown hotel. The ambience was sophisticated. Leather chairs, subdued lighting, the hushed murmur of lucrative deals being forged over expensive whiskey. Wells was a shrewd, no-nonsense businessman who had amassed his fortune in commercial real estate. He didn't waste time on those who weren't serious. So tell me again, Wells prompted, sipping his espresso, why Whitmore and Klein? Dorian leaned forward. Because they're in distress and they don't even realize the extent of it. Wells raised an eyebrow. Explain. Dorian retrieved a folder from his briefcase, opening it on the table between them. They've been hemorrhaging clients for the past year. Poor leadership, outdated methodologies, misallocated funds. They appear successful on the surface, but their debt burden is crushing them. He tapped the papers. I give it 6 months before they either downsize or sell. Wells scrutinized the figures, flipping through the pages. You're certain about this? Dorian nodded. I've been observing them for a while. Their biggest accounts are withdrawing, client retention is plummeting. They're relying on reputation, not results, and that's catching up with them. Wells smirked. And you intend to be the one to acquire them? Dorian didn't hesitate. I don't just want to acquire them, I want to revitalize them. Restructure, eliminate inefficiencies, introduce fresh talent, make them profitable again. Wells leaned back, tapping his fingers against the table. It's a bold move. It's a smart move, Dorian corrected. Wells chuckled. You possess confidence, I'll grant you that. He took another sip of his espresso, then set the cup down and reached into his jacket pocket. He produced a check and slid it across the table. Dorian looked down at it. The amount was precisely what he needed to initiate the first step. "You have my backing," Wells stated. "Don't make me regret it." Dorian picked up the check, feeling the gravity of the moment. This was it. The people who had mocked him had no idea they were laughing at their future boss, and soon they were going to discover it the hard way. Dorian understood that patience was paramount. Acquiring a company wasn't like buying a car or trading a stock. It demanded meticulous strategy, precise timing, and knowing exactly when to strike. He had spent months dissecting Whitmore and Klein's finances, uncovering their vulnerabilities, tracking their every misstep. The company wasn't merely struggling, it was in a free fall. On the surface, they still boasted the sleek office, the polished brand, the illusion of triumph. But beneath it was chaos. Their major clients were scaling back, expenses were spiraling out of control, and their leadership had no idea how to rectify it. Dorian wasn't the only one who had noticed. Rumors began to circulate within industry circles. Whispers of impending layoffs, discussions of restructuring. Some employees sensed it. Others remained in denial, convinced their firm was invincible. But Dorian knew the truth. With Wells and the other investors' support, he began to make his moves, discreetly, strategically. The initial step involved securing the shares. Whitmore and Klein wasn't a publicly traded company, but it had multiple stakeholders. Former executives, private investors, individuals who had invested years ago and were now desperate to divest before the collapse. Dorian approached them one by one, presenting offers they couldn't refuse. Initially, some were skeptical. A delivery guy acquiring a significant marketing firm? But money spoke and Dorian held the leverage. One by one they signed over their shares. It took weeks, late-night meetings, careful negotiations. But by the time the paperwork was finalized, Dorian held the controlling interest. He owned Whitmore and Klein. The final step was making it official. The current CEO, Richard Langford, was a man whose career was built on inherited wealth and strong connections. He wasn't particularly astute, just fortunate, and his luck had finally run out. Dorian scheduled a meeting. No prior warning, no pretense, just a direct email to Langford's assistant. Subject: immediate discussion required. The assistant, a woman named Ellen who had worked at Whitmore and Klein for over 2 decades, blinked in bewilderment when she saw Dorian's name in the sender's field. She had seen him drop off packages countless times. Why was he emailing the CEO directly? She knocked on Langford's office door, stepping inside cautiously. "Sir, I just received an urgent email from Dorian Matthews." Langford didn't look up. "Who?" "The delivery man," Ellen said hesitantly. Langford's fingers paused over his keyboard. He let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "You mean the guy from the lobby? What could he possibly want?" "He's requesting an immediate meeting." Langford leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. He was already in a foul mood. Profit reports were grim, and their largest client had just terminated their contract. The last thing he had time for was nonsense. "Fine, bring him in," Langford muttered, waving a dismissive hand. "Let's get this joke over with." By the time Dorian walked into the Whitmore and Klein office that morning, the energy in the building had already shifted. There were murmurs, glances exchanged in the hallways. The receptionist, the same one who had barely acknowledged him for years, suddenly sat up straighter when he entered. Langford was waiting in his office, clearly agitated. He didn't even stand when Dorian walked in. "What's this about?" Langford asked, barely glancing up from his computer. Dorian took a seat across from him, placing a thick envelope on the desk. "It's about the fact that as of this morning, I own the majority of Whitmore and Klein." Langford finally looked at him. He frowned, then let out a short, dismissive laugh. "You? That's impossible." Dorian didn't blink. "Check the paperwork." Langford hesitated, then grabbed the envelope, pulling out the documents. As he flipped through them, his face drained of color. He looked up again, this time with a different expression. Panic. "This is a joke," he muttered. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Dorian leaned back in the chair, composed. "I think I'm your new boss." Langford slammed the papers down. "This firm isn't for sale." "It was," Dorian said smoothly. "You just didn't know it." Langford's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at the numbers again as if trying to find an error, but there was no mistake. The realization hit him like a brick. He wasn't the CEO anymore. Dorian stood up. I'll give you until the end of the day to clear out your office. Langford stared at him, speechless. Dorian turned toward the door, but before he left, he glanced over his shoulder. Oh, and Richard, he let a small smile cross his lips. Don't worry, I'm sure there's a delivery job out there for you somewhere. Langford's face turned crimson, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. The office would never be the same again, and for the first time in years, Dorian Matthews wasn't just passing through. He was in charge. Dorian understood that acquiring Whitmore and Klein was one thing. Ensuring everyone comprehended the implications was another. As he exited Langford's office, the murmurs in the building intensified. Employees shot glances at each other, whispering behind cupped hands, confusion etched across their faces. They had seen him before hundreds of times, but never like this. No uniform, no scanner clipped to his belt, just unwavering confidence in his stride and a commanding presence. Some recognized the folder he had carried into the CEO's office, and when Langford's door slammed shut behind him, a few people rose from their desks, trying to piece together what had just occurred. Dorian ignored the stares. He had a more pressing task. He turned to Ellen, Langford's longtime assistant. She was observing him carefully, her expression unreadable. I need the entire company in the main conference room, Dorian stated. 10 minutes. Ellen hesitated. She had served Langford for years, but she had also witnessed firsthand the growing cracks within the company. She glanced toward the closed office door, then back at Dorian. I'll send the email now, she said. Minutes later, the employees of Whitmore and Klein shuffled into the sleek, glass-walled conference room, murmuring among themselves. Ryan Caldwell, the same senior executive who had scoffed at the idea of Dorian being in charge, leaned over to his colleague and scoffed. What is this? Ryan muttered. A security briefing? His friend smirked. Maybe they're laying off the cleaning crew. The joking ceased when Dorian stepped to the front of the room. No one sat down, no one spoke. The silence stretched as he surveyed them, meeting their gazes. Some looked confused, others impatient, and a few like Ryan still appeared amused. Dorian finally spoke. I'm sure you're all wondering why I called this meeting. A few exchanged glances, shifting on their feet. As of this morning, Dorian continued, I am the new majority owner of Whitmore and Klein. A ripple of stunned silence moved through the room. Someone let out a small, disbelieving laugh, as if expecting a punchline. It never came. Ryan folded his arms, smirking. You're joking. Dorian turned his gaze to him, his expression unchanging. Do I look like I'm joking? Ryan's smirk faltered. Dorian placed a thick stack of documents on the conference table. The financials, the contracts, every signed deal that made this possible. He gestured to the papers. If anyone has doubts, feel free to take a look. Nobody moved. The weight of reality settled over the room. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a mistake. Dorian Matthews, the man they had ignored, the man they had laughed at, was now their boss. For the first time since stepping into that building, Dorian allowed himself a brief pause. He let them absorb the moment, let them process it. Then he spoke again. I've worked in this building for years. Most of you never noticed me. Some of you did and made sure I knew exactly what you thought of me. His gaze flickered briefly toward Ryan. I remember every joke, every insult, every time someone assumed I didn't belong. Ryan shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. But I also remember something else, Dorian continued. I remember watching this company make mistake after mistake. I remember seeing potential squandered because leadership refused to adapt. And I remember thinking that if I had the chance I would do things differently. He took a step forward, his tone resolute. That chance is now. A nervous energy permeated the room. People who had been standing with arms crossed slowly unfolded them. Others who had been leaning against the wall straightened. Dorian glanced around the room, then let his next words land with precision. Things are about to change. Some of you won't like it. Some of you won't be here for it. Silence. Dorian gave them a moment to absorb that before continuing. But for those of you who are willing to work, who are willing to be part of something stronger, something better, you'll have a place here. He let his eyes sweep the room one last time. This is not the same company it was yesterday, and it's definitely not the same company it was when I walked in here as a delivery man. Another pause. Then, with a calm authority that left no room for doubt, he concluded, if you don't like that, there's the door. The weight of his words settled over the room like a final verdict. And for the first time, the people in that office realized Dorian Matthews wasn't just passing through. He was here to stay. The conference room was thick with silence. No one moved, no one spoke. The reality of what had just transpired settled in like a slow-building storm. Dorian could discern it in their faces. The disbelief, the unease, the subtle glances exchanged between employees who moments ago had felt invincible. Then finally someone broke the silence. Ryan Caldwell let out a short, bitter, hollow laugh. He shook his head, crossing his arms. "This is insane," he muttered. "You can't be serious." Dorian turned his gaze to him, unwavering. "Do you think I'd stand here and say all this if I wasn't serious?" Ryan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "So what, you come in here, throw your weight around, and we're all just supposed to fall in line?" Dorian didn't blink. "No. You're supposed to do your job. If you can't handle that, you're free to leave." Ryan scoffed. "Right, because you, of all people, are suddenly the expert on running a firm like this." Dorian took a step closer, his voice resolute. "I know this company better than you think, Ryan. I've spent years observing your operations, witnessing the arrogance, the squandered potential, the antiquated strategies. And I've spent even more years learning how to successfully manage businesses." Ryan clenched his jaw. "That's not, it is," Dorian cut in smoothly. "And I have the reports to prove it. Over-promising, under-delivering, failing to adjust strategies when the market shifted." He tapped the folder. "The client walked and took millions in revenue with them." Ryan's face burned red. Dorian shut the folder. "So, if we're questioning who deserves to be here, I'd say you have a lot more to answer for than I do." Silence. Ryan's mouth opened slightly as if he intended to argue, but he didn't, because he knew the numbers didn't lie. Dorian took a deep breath and turned his attention to the rest of the room. "This is the point where some of you start to panic, where you start wondering if you're about to lose your jobs." He let the words linger for a moment before continuing. "And the answer is, some of you will." That got their attention. Dorian gestured toward the documents in front of him. "I've already conducted my research. I know who brings value to this company. I know who's been coasting. And I know who's been taking credit for other people's work." Some people visibly tensed. Others stole glances at their colleagues as if suddenly realizing the repercussions of their office politics. Dorian continued, "There's dead weight in this company, and I don't carry dead weight. If you're here to do your job, to work, to contribute, to help rebuild something stronger, you have nothing to worry about. But if you're here just to collect a paycheck and maintain appearances," he shrugged, "you won't last long." He let that settle before delivering the final blow. "I'll be sending out termination notices by the end of the day." The room felt as if it had been deprived of oxygen. Ryan took a step forward. "You can't just—" "I can," Dorian said simply, "and I will." Ryan's jaw clenched. His pride wouldn't allow him to be the first to back down. He straightened his tie, lifted his chin. "Fine. If this is how it's going to be, then I quit." Dorian met his stare. "That's the first good decision you've made in years." Ryan scoffed, shaking his head. He turned and stormed out of the conference room, slamming the door behind him. A heavy silence followed. Dorian let the moment breathe, then turned to the rest of the staff. "For those of you still here, remember this. Whitmore and Klein isn't just going to survive, it's going to become something better than it ever was before. But that only happens if the right people are in place." He let his gaze move across the room, taking in their reactions. Some nervous, some determined, some still processing what had just occurred. "If you're willing to step up, to work, to actually build something meaningful, you'll have a place here." Another pause. "But if you're only here because you think you deserve to be, because you're comfortable, because you think nothing will change," he gestured toward the door, "you can follow Ryan." The room remained silent, but this time it wasn't shock. It was a dawning realization. Things had irrevocably changed. Dorian wasn't the man they had dismissed anymore, and from this moment forward he never would be again. By the time Dorian exited the conference room, the energy in the office had completely transformed. Some employees sat at their desks in stunned silence. Others whispered in hushed tones, stealing glances at the man they had ignored for years. Some appeared afraid, others intrigued, and a select few looked genuinely inspired. Dorian remained unaffected by any of it. He had accomplished what was necessary. Now the true work began. As he stepped into what was now his office, formerly Langford's, he let out a slow breath. The space was larger than he had anticipated. Leather furniture, bookshelves laden with unread business tomes, a massive oak desk that likely cost more than his first car. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, gazing out over the city. This moment was supposed to feel different. He had spent months, even years, striving for this, battling every assumption, every dismissal, every instance someone had underestimated him. He had achieved it. He had proven them wrong. And yet, standing here, staring at the skyline, he realized something. This wasn't about revenge. It had never been about that. If it were, the satisfaction would have faded by now. He would have reveled in the triumph of proving them wrong, of watching Ryan storm out, of witnessing the expressions on their faces when they realized the man they had mocked now owned everything they stood on. But that feeling wasn't what propelled him. He had done this because he knew he could build something superior not just for himself, but for the people in that office who had been overlooked, dismissed, underestimated, just as he had been. There were individuals in that building who possessed talent, who had ideas, who, under the right leadership, could transform this company into something extraordinary. And there were those who no longer belonged there. He had spent years learning that respect wasn't bestowed. It was seized, earned, forged through action, not words. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Ellen, Langford's former assistant, stepped inside hesitantly. "Everything all right?" she asked. Dorian turned from the window, nodding. "Just getting used to the view." She offered a small smile. "I imagine it looks a lot different from this side." He studied her for a moment. She wasn't like the others. She had been with this company long enough to witness its ascent, its blunders and its gradual decline. "I have a question for you," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "All right. Why are you still here?" Ellen folded her arms, contemplating. "Because I love what this place used to be, and I think under the right leadership it could be that again." Dorian nodded slowly. Ellen hesitated. "If I'm being honest, I didn't expect this. I've seen a lot of CEOs come and go, but I never thought I'd see this company end up in your hands." Dorian chuckled. "Neither did they." She exhaled, shaking her head with a small smirk. "Langford's gone, Ryan quit. There's a lot of uncertainty right now. There always is when change happens." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Well, for what it's worth, I think this place could use some change." Dorian smirked. "Then let's get to work." As she walked out, he turned back to the window. Change was coming, not just for Whitmore and Klein, not just for the employees still trying to grasp what had occurred, but for him. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't just proving himself, he was leading. And this was only the beginning. The lesson was clear. Never underestimate someone simply because of their origins, because one day they might be the ones signing your paycheck.